So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to talk about how you can take a board, piece of lumber like this, and make a bowl out of it just like this. So what I'm going to do because hopefully this presentation won't take too long, I'm going to pass these around. Basically what you're going to do, and I'll explain it in much more detail, but basically you cut rings, you glue them together to form a form that you can turn on the lathe, and then when you're done you have a bowl like this. So I'm going to pass these around. This is on a waste block, and it has a base and two layers, 2 rings. This one has a base and 3 rings. That's the only difference. Okay, so we take our board, and the very first thing we do is you mill this thing until it's completely flat on both sides, parallel, top and bottom. That's very important. Use a planer or a thickness sander, something like that. So once that's done, then you take, I don't know if you can see this. Yeah. Then you take the board and you cut it right down the middle with your table saw, and then you mark the center point. And then you clamp them together. After you clamp them together, then you mark your center point. And now you take your compass and you draw concentric circles. Depending on how many layers you're going to have, you draw concentric circles. And I'll explain how you determine the radius for each of those circles in a few minutes. So when you're done, you've clamped this together, you've made your circles. It looks like this. You have your center point, and then you have your circles. Anybody has questions, holler. So you unclamp it, and now you have 2 pieces with the center point and the half of the circles. So now you go to your bandsaw and you tilt your bandsaw to the angle that you want your bowl to be. So in this case, I don't know what angle this is, but you determine the angle that you want on your bowl, and you tilt your table probably 90 degrees minus this angle. So you've got your bandsaw blade straight up and down, the table is angled, and now what you do is very carefully, right along the line, right along each of these lines, you cut with the bandsaw. Very carefully, stay right on the line. And when you're done, this is what you end up with. You have 2 pieces for the base, and you notice that the sides are angled, and then you have 2 pieces for each of the rings. Okay? And this is just waste wood. Any questions?
The reason you're cutting it in half is for the bandsaw?
Yes.
You did it like with a jigsaw and
Yes.
the hole, you could do it.
Good point.
Yeah, I was guessing that, but I didn't. I was thinking that's
He's exactly right. If you had a jigsaw, you wouldn't have to cut the board in two. All right, so we have our half rings. Now we need to glue them together. So we start with the base, and I use, if you don't have a disc sander, then you need to sand these faces because we're going to glue them together. So you just take it on a piece of sandpaper, I've got a piece of melamine here, and you just go back and forth a few times just to make sure that it's completely flat. Then what I do is you hold it up to the light, make sure you can't see any light through it. Then what I do is I put a little glue on one side and use a screwdriver or a spatula or something and spread it out over the whole thing. Then take the other piece while you're holding it down, push them together and slide them back and forth a little bit, and then hold them for 3 or 4 seconds, and that's it. Set those aside. Now we have our first ring. You do the same thing, but you got to be very careful not to rotate this thing. So you just a little bit of sanding. If you had your table saw 90 degrees, there shouldn't be too much sanding you have to do. Okay. And you do the same thing. You put a drop of glue here and a drop of glue here, spread it around, bring the other one up, kind of squash them together, hold them for 3 or 4 seconds, and that's all you need. And you do that with every ring that you have.
You just use tight bond glue?
Tight bond, yeah.
And is that like an 80 grit or?
80 grit.
Okay.
So, when you're done, this is what you end up with. You end up with the base. Again, all the sides are angled. First ring, second ring. Now it's time to start gluing these things together so we can come up with a form that we can turn.
You line all the cuts at the same place?
Sorry?
You line up all the cuts at the same place, or do you stagger them?
You stagger them. Yeah. So there's multiple ways of doing this next step, but you take a piece of a waste block and you use the tailstock and you bring it up, and you've got your waste block on a chuck or a faceplate. You make it round, you flatten it, and you flatten this thing too. After there might have been a little glue squeeze out, so you always want to sand just a little bit to make it perfectly flat. So this is on a chuck. You bring the tailstock up, and you still have your center point from when you first started, and then you put glue on this thing and you smash them together, turn it a little bit, let it set for an hour, half an hour, whatever. And now you have the start of your bowl blank. So here's one that I've already done. The base ring is already on here. So what you want to do is take your tools, scraper. I use a scraper. You can use whatever you want, and just lightly touch this up until it's perfectly smooth. And what I've got a piece of sandpaper, not this big, but you hold it up like that while the lathe is running, and that'll make it perfectly flat. All right, you take your next ring, do the same thing. Get it completely flat. And you turn it over. Take this off. Now there's no way to use the tailstock that I'm aware of anyway. You might be able to figure it out, but anyway, you don't need to do that. What you're going to do is you're going to set this on here with glue, wiggle it around a little bit, get it centered as best you can, put a weight on it, let it set for half an hour, 45 minutes, whatever, and then you have two rings, or the base and the first ring. And then you do that with the last ring.
How much do you offset the glue joint?
A little bit. You only have to offset it just a little bit. It gives it a little more strength. So you do the same thing with the last ring, or however many rings you've got. And that's how you end up with the form that I passed around.
And you true up each ring as you glue them?
Yes, good point. Each time you put one on, then you true it up on the lathe before you glue it to the next one.
Why did you have to didn't while the sandpaper was on there?
What?
Why couldn't you just why couldn't you just rub it around on the sandpaper?
Oh,
The sandpaper on a board.
that makes it flat.
Yep, because that one is running for power. You just push it against it.
That makes it flat. Okay. So, any questions about that? That's the basic technique. There's really not a whole lot to it. It's once you've done it, it's pretty easy.
Now, do you use different species of woods at times?
You can. This is yellow heart. Yeah, you can use anything you want.
Do you use different species in the same bowl?
Yeah, I'll show you that in a minute.
Now, if you way that you do it, you have a consistent angle, but can you adjust the angle
As you go up.
as you go up?
Not that I know of. All right, so that's basically the procedure. Now, what I wanted to show you was how do you determine the angle and how do you make the semicircles. So this is a board that I'm going to use to demonstrate it. It's a little thicker than you probably would use. Hopefully you can see that. Can you?
Yeah.
Okay. So the first thing you do is you mark the center of the bowl. I mean, excuse me, of the board. So this is the center. Then you determine what size base you want. In this case, I wanted 1.5 inches, so that's 3/4 on each side. So you make a mark there and make a mark there. Then you take your angle gauge, and from that mark for the base, you make a line up to the top. Then you take your square, and from that top mark, then you make a dotted line down to the base. And that's how you know where the next line starts, angled line. So where that dotted line meets the bottom, then you put the angle gauge there and you make a line. And you keep doing this for however many rings you want on your bowl. And you'll probably find that you should use a pencil because it won't come out just exactly right, and you'll need to erase it, adjust your angle, and try again. So when you're all done with that, then you transfer the lines to the top, the angle lines, the top of the angle lines. Get your compass, put on the center, and this is how you get your half rings. Is that clear as mud?
Yeah, it's clear.
Okay. So, in reality, when you do that, you would have had a second board up here. I'm only showing you how you determine these points. Now, what I usually do when I'm doing this is I will get a pencil and paper or a CAD program, whatever, and I'll draw this part out just to make sure that I know what angle that I can get and get the number of rings that I want.
I have a question. You know, the thicker the board is, wouldn't that give you a little bit of room to get a little bit of the shape?
The thicker the board, the thicker the wall thickness is going to be. In other words, she's right. The thicker you have the board here, the thicker the wall's going to be, and you'll have more room to curve or whatever. Yeah. Okay. All right, now, what else do I want to show you? So, to answer someone's question, you can, the obvious advantage of this is you can make a nice little bowl with just a board. The obvious disadvantage is you don't have much wall thickness to play with. But you can do other things. Like on this one, I started with a piece of yellow heart, and I cut them just like I did these. And then I replaced the bottom, the bottom with a piece of walnut. And then I made a segmented ring out of walnut and glued that to the top. And so you have a little more room to maybe sweep the edge out, whatever. So you can play around with it. The other thing is there are a number of videos out on in YouTube that will explain this and better than what I've done. Some really fancy things you can. Instead of using a flat, plain piece of board like this, what some guys will do is they'll laminate boards together. Think of it as like a breadboard. You've seen those. And then they go through this procedure, and it makes some really interesting designs. So go to YouTube if you're really interested. There's some good YouTubes out there.
What do they call it?
Bowl from a board. So do a search, bowl from a board. So when you first start this, there's some decisions that you have to make. One, you have to know what the board thickness is that you're going to use. You have to determine what angle you want to use. You have to determine how big a foot you want on your bowl. And then how many rings do you want in your bowl? And those things will determine the size of the board that you're going to need and how many rings you can get out of a board like this. So, any questions? I apologize again for the interruption.
Okay?
Okay?
Had a question over here.
I was gonna ask you, do you space all those rings? Do you space the rings all the same distance apart?
What?
Do you space the rings all the same distance apart? Do you make the rings,
Yes,
okay.
yeah. And the reason you do that, it's a good question. The reason that you draw your angle line, and then you make a dotted line straight down, and then make your angle line and a line straight down. If you don't do that, when you do that, then this layer is going to set right on top of the first layer, and the second layer is going to set right on top of the other layer. If you don't do that, they won't match up.